My friends, we have been exploring the past several videos the role human consciousness plays in the Bible, particularly in marvels, dreams, and visions. We seem to have been hardwired for experiences of the divine through 35 different states of awareness. With this in mind, let's consider the story found in all the Gospels of Jesus walking on the sea. What exactly is going on in this story? Is Jesus violating the laws of buoyancy? Is he overriding the physical laws of the universe? Is the point of this story that Jesus is so powerful, he can do the impossible with ease? Everyone seems very familiar with the Gospel story describing Jesus walking on the Sea of Galilee. He's heading toward his disciples who are in a boat. Taking everything we've been learning, let's turn to the earliest account of this story from the Gospel called Mark. Mark chapter 6, verses 45 through 52. Then Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and precede him to the other side toward Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. And when he had taken leave of them, he went off to the mountain to pray. When it was evening, the boat was far out on the sea, and he was alone on the shore. He saw that they were tossed about while rowing, for the wind was against them. About the fourth watch of the night, he came toward them, walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out. They had all seen him and were terrified. But at once he spoke with them. "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." He got into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely astounded. They had not understood the incident of the loaves. On the contrary, their hearts were hardened. That is the Markan version of the story. Now let's look at the Matthean version. Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. Then Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and precede him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. After doing so, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When it was evening, he was there alone. Meanwhile, the boat, already a few miles offshore, was being tossed about by the waves, for the wind was against it. During the fourth watch of the night, he came toward them, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified. "It is a ghost," they said, and they cried out in fear. At once Jesus spoke to them. "Take courage, it is I. Do not be afraid." Peter said to him in reply, "Kyrie, if it is you, command me to come to you on the waters." He said, "Come." Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind charging, he became afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Kyrie, save me!" Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, "O you of little loyalty, why did you doubt?" After they had gotten into the boat, the wind died down. Those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Now, having read the Markan and Matthean versions of this story, let's turn to the fourth Gospel, John chapter 6, verses 16 through 21. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and were trying to go across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea rose because a strong wind was blowing. When they had rowed about 20 or 30 stadios, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat. They were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land to which they were going. These three stories, while the same, are also pretty different, aren't they, in their details? So once more, my friends, what exactly is going on in these stories of Jesus walking on the sea? Is he doing something that violates the rules of nature? Is he violating science? Is the point of this story that Jesus is so powerful he can do whatever he wants, no matter how impossible or absurd? We're going to explore these questions and a whole lot more, dealing with Jesus walking on the sea in the next several presentations. Having explored three different gospel versions of Jesus walking on the sea, we ask once more, what exactly is going on in these stories? Is Jesus overriding the physical laws governing the universe? What does the story mean? The English phrase inspired by this event, "she thinks she can walk on water," intends to describe somebody who can accomplish the impossible with ease. Like many popular interpretations of the Bible, this one too misses the mark. All human beings actually do walk on water when it rains. However, to talk about someone walking on the sea is an entirely different thing. The Hebrew word hayam and the Greek thalassa translate to English as sea. This is a key word in this gospel story and in the entire biblical tradition. A clearer understanding of that word and reality suggests a new interpretation of this event in the life of Jesus. Let's talk about the sea. Many ancient cultures, including that of Palestine, personified much, if not all, of reality. The sea was no exception. It was not a what, but a who. In the Mesopotamian traditions, Tiamat was the primordial watery source of life, a goddess. Contemporary scholars now discount that Tiamat is the source for the biblical Tehom, which is the word for the deep or abyss, yet both words may share some root meaning. In Genesis chapter 1, verse 2, the earth is said to be tohu vabohu. Tohu sounds a lot like Tiamat, with darkness over the Tehom, the abyss. In the story of the flood in the 600th year of Noah's life, the great Tehom, this primordial sea abyss, bursts forth. Later on, the fountains of the abyss, the Tehom, are closed. Contemporary biblical scholars correctly recognize that the basic ideas of these Semitic myths derive from a common and shared cultural perspective. The distinctive significance of the biblical tradition among these myths is that the God of Israel controls this potentially unruly sea and does not gain his mastery over it as a result by winning a battle with it. Modern biblical readers must keep these personifications in mind in order to properly appreciate biblical narratives on their own cultural terms. The sea in the Bible is not so much a what, but a who. Now let's get into seas known to biblical people. But in doing that, let's keep in mind what St. Thomas Aquinas and our medieval ancestors in the faith taught us, that all God talk, all theology, is analogy. That is, everything human beings know and say about God is rooted in human experience, which is always culturally interpreted. Bible readers want to know which seas were familiar to biblical people. Even land-bound peasants like Jesus and his followers knew about the Mediterranean Sea. In the Bible, the Mediterranean Sea is often referred to simply as Hayam, the sea, and sometimes the Great Sea. The psalmist presents a vivid description of how this body of water could turn violent and destructive. The voice of Yahweh is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. Yahweh over the mighty waters. Because this watery presence looms so large west of the land of Israel, this Hebrew word for sea, Hayam, also served as the designation for the compass direction west. And you can see why. A great other-than-human person, the Mediterranean Sea. Also famous from the Bible are other seas, such as the Sea of Reeds, usually translated Red Sea in Exodus. This is the sea that is crossed by ancient Hebrews in their escape from Egypt, or perhaps marsh or swamp. It is difficult to locate geographically. The sea located in the Araba region, south of Palestine, the deepest point on the surface of the planet Earth, is called by different names. The Salt Sea, the Sea of the Plain, or the Eastern Sea. Its high concentration of salt and other minerals permits no visible life to exist in it, hence the ancient Roman name for it, the Dead Sea. This name is deceptive, though, because even though this sea is usually calm, occasionally, severe and dangerous thunderstorms do develop. This is quite in keeping with the dense nature of this personified body of water. The Dead Sea, not so dead. And what you're looking at is not so much a body of water, a what, but a who. Finally, there is the Sea of Galilee, which figures so prominently in the Synoptic Gospels we call Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Its most ancient name was Gennereth, from the Hebrew word for harp, perhaps describing the shape of the lake, or perhaps the sound of its waters. In the Hellenistic and Roman periods, it was called Gennesaret. The Gospel we call John calls it the Lake of Tiberias. Situated about 640 feet below sea level, its size today is 13 miles long and 8 miles wide at its widest part. The Sea of Galilee. By the way, it's important when you read these stories to have a map handy, to see where Jesus came from, the region he and his ministry began in. This is a personified body of water, a who and not a what. Of special interest is the wind pattern on this sea. Two large valleys on the west side usher in strong afternoon breezes from the west, particularly during the dry season. These can quickly churn up waves on the peaceful waters to a height of 7 or more feet. In the winter, a similar wind pattern from the east can produce the same effect. No experienced fisherman would sail in such storms, and if he were caught in a sudden squall, he would do anything possible to return to shore quickly. This personified body of water has a tempestuous nature. Now, Jesus, walking on the Sea of Galilee toward his disciples who are in a boat, has been variously interpreted. Some scholars consider it a nature miracle, which means an action that clearly surpasses the so-called laws of nature. Miracle is a nice post-Enlightenment word, a violation or an overriding of the physical laws governing the universe. While this might make sense to the modern post-Enlightenment mind, our ancient ancestors in the faith lived by the simple perception that whatever happened actually happened. While it may have been a singular, rare, or infrequent experience, it wasn't contrary to anything. If our ancestors in the faith saw it, they believed that it really happened. If it was beyond customary human ability, I mean what they saw, it had to have some other than human explanation, but still a personal explanation. Everything that happens, people in this world ask, not what happened, but who done it. Some person had to be responsible for it. Other scholars consider this event to be an appearance of the risen Jesus that has been retrojected back into his earthly life. They connect the story linguistically by the sea, upon the sea, particularly with John chapter 21, and also with the literary form of other resurrection appearances. These biblical scholars also deny any real parallels between this story of Jesus walking on the sea with Old Testament stories of walking on or through the sea, like, for example, Job chapter 9, verse 8, and also similar stories in pre-gospel polytheistic literature about Orion, Poseidon, Euphemus, Aphrodite, and others. These scholars correctly note that none of these stories could have served as a model for the evangelists, but they neglect to take seriously the fact that such perspectives about certain kinds of persons coursing over the personified sea were quite common in the ancient Mediterranean world. Moreover, these biblical scholars do not provide a satisfactory explanation of what the first readers or hearers of such a story about Jesus walking on the sea would have gotten out of it. Invariably, in these scholars, there is too hasty a segue into a theological interpretation linked with the risen Lord and the Eucharist. What is going on in these accounts about Jesus walking on the sea? Is Jesus actually walking on water, H2O, in the same way that other human beings walk on the solid ground? If you respond, yes, he is this then a violation of scientific laws? Are you imagining that Jesus is violating scientific laws, physical laws governing the universe? Were the people who wrote these stories part of a culture that was familiar with science and scientific laws? In science, we Western people recognize buoyancy force. When a boat goes into the water, the ship displaces so much water that it is kept up, it doesn't sink. Objects will float if the gravitational force is less than the buoyancy force. So in other words, an object will float if it weighs less than the amount of water it displaces. Boats float because the water resists the weight of the boat, and the boat displaces the water. The objects like rocks sink because, although they're heavy, they displace only a little water. For any person to stand on a depth of water, say like the average depth of the Sea of Galilee, their total body weight divided by 8 pounds will tell you how many gallons of water his or her feet would have to displace. So a 160-pound man would have to displace 20 gallons of water with each step. Is that what the authors of the Gospels are trying to communicate to their readers? That that's what Jesus is doing? With each step, he's pushing away 20 gallons of water? My friends, you cannot know what the Bible means until you realize what the Bible meant. One difficulty 21st century Western people have is that, according to our consensus reality, there exist laws of nature. And that is why we have a good post-Enlightenment definition of miracle as something contrary to the laws of nature. So with that in mind, let me tell you a little story about my friend, Stephen. Stephen is a really good man. He's brilliant, he's funny, and like all of us, he lives in the 21st century Western world. He is deeply concerned about the problems in the world and suffering and injustice. And he doesn't just think about it, he tries to do something about it and help people. In addition to all of that, Stephen is a committed Catholic Christian, and he is a catechist, a religious instructor. Stephen reads in the Gospels the story about Jesus walking on the sea, and Stephen concludes that this story is informing readers that Jesus has the power to override or defy the laws of nature, the scientific laws, physical laws governing the universe. And Stephen also says, I believe this report. I believe Jesus can do that. Okay, let me also tell you about another friend of mine named Ricky. Ricky also, like all of us and Stephen, lives in the 21st century Western world. Ricky also happens to be a brilliant, funny, and deeply compassionate man. He is deeply concerned about the terrible problems that face us today. And he doesn't just think about them, he tries to do something about them. Like Stephen, he is a very good man. Ricky also reads the Bible and reads the story of Jesus walking on the sea. And like Stephen, Ricky concludes that the story is trying to communicate that Jesus has the power to defy the laws of physics, the laws governing the universe, the laws of nature. And to this report, Ricky says, this is complete and utter bullshit. It's absurdity. It's not true. I don't believe this. Two wonderfully good, brilliant, funny, deeply compassionate men, both of whom read the same story in the Gospels and conclude that the story is trying to say, or proposing for the reader, that Jesus has the power to override or defy the laws governing the universe. Stephen accepts the report as true. Ricky thinks it's hogwash, nonsense, absurd. He rejects it as untrue. But do you know something that these two 21st century men have in common, besides being brilliant and funny and good men? They are both completely wrong about the story and its meaning. Both have misread the story anachronistically and ethnocentrically. They have distorted its meaning and they have misunderstood it. Indeed, there is no Greek or Hebrew word in the Bible that can be translated into our post-Enlightenment word miracle, meaning something contrary to the laws of nature. Science, laws of nature, and violations to the laws of nature are simply not part of the consensus reality of the authors of the Gospels or any biblical author or character. They could never have thought of stories like Jesus walking on the sea as a miracle. Try to understand. Consider the concept triangle. Isn't it true that before you can have the concept or idea of triangle, you first have to have grasped what an angle is? Doesn't angle logically come before triangle? And in the same way, this applies to miracles. A miracle is a violation of the physical laws governing the universe. But before you can understand what miracles are, don't you have to logically first have a concept of physical laws governing the universe? Don't you have to have a belief in a set of laws governing the natural order? If you don't have that, can you have miracle? Different works in the Old Testament speak of marvels and marvelous things and wonders, but we should never translate the Hebrew word wonder or marvel into miracle. I want you to consider a 21st century Israeli mom, delighted at her collegiate daughter's fine grades at the university. When she exclaims in Hebrew, "Marvelous!" she is not declaring, "Wow, what a violation of the laws of nature. My dumb as dirt daughter did pretty well. She did an absurdity." No, she's not saying that. She is saying, "Marvelous! My very capable daughter studied hard, prepared very well, and applied herself, and look at this marvel that came about." Marvels and wonders. This is how God's deeds, God's acts, God's works are described in the Hebrew Bible. Not miracles, violations of the laws of the universe. They don't have a concept of laws governing the universe. I mean the biblical authors and the biblical characters. And there's no interventions in history. That's not how they think. Intervening implies that God is sometimes absent to the world. Is that how our biblical ancestors in the faith conceive of God? Sometimes the absent one? No. God is never the absent one. God is always the present one in the Bible. So no interventions and no miracles, wonders, marvels. And this is how Jesus' deeds are described in the New Testament. The Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, say that Jesus did mighty deeds. The fourth Gospel, John, says Jesus did signs and works, but no miracles. There are no miracles in the Bible, if by miracles we mean post-Enlightenment violations of physical laws, or the laws of nature, or scientific laws. I want you to think about this in light of Jesus walking on the sea. Next time, we're going to conclude with a culturally plausible understanding of what's going on exactly with Jesus being seen walking on the sea. In our last presentation, we spoke about Stephen and Ricky and how they were misreading the gospel story of Jesus walking on the sea as if it had been written by, for, and about Americans and other Western people. Even the most current studies attempting to understand the Jesus of history generally take little cognizance of the fact that he became incarnate in the ancient Mediterranean world. Anthropologists who specialize in this region at its literary records point out that approximately 90% of world cultures and 80% of circum-Mediterranean cultures readily experience altered states of consciousness. From the biblical record alone, which is included in the Anthropological Databank, it is evident that the people of this ancient culture were certainly among that 80%. Studies of Moroccan Jews in Israel are particularly enlightening in this regard. When they were forcibly repatriated to Israel in the 1950s and 1960s, the Moroccan Jews carried with them not only their personal belongings, but their beliefs, values, and traditions. They revitalized their practices and attached them to new sites and new saints to substitute for those they left behind. One of these takes place at the tomb of Rabbi Shimeon Bar Yochai at Meren Near-Zafed. On the anniversary of his death, these devotees make a pilgrimage to his tomb, celebrate a picnic-like feast in the surrounding countryside, and expect to see him in a dream. And they do. The dream pattern typically has 4 elements, common in altered state of consciousness experiences, or ASC experiences for short. 1. Those experiencing the vision are initially frightened, and 2. Do not recognize the figure appearing before them. 3. The figure appearing before them offers calming assurance, do not be afraid. And 4. Identifies herself or himself, it is I. Then the figure offers information. Maybe it's clarification of identity, or the granting of a favor, for example, healing or a healing strategy. The purpose of the experience is to illuminate a puzzle in life, or to suggest or approve a line of conduct. Notice that this is not a literary form. It is a pattern of human experience constructed by the culture rather than by someone's creative imagination. Jesus and those who knew him were quite familiar with and adept at experiences of alternate reality. Accounts of Jesus' baptism, transfiguration, walking on the Sea of Galilee, and post-death or post-resurrection appearances readily fit into the common Mediterranean cultural experiences of altered states of consciousness, even when the experience that is reported is so in an incomplete or selective manner. Aside from dreams and angelic appearances featured prominently in the infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke, the synoptics report 5 main incidents of such visions and/or appearances in the career of Jesus. The dunking of Jesus, also called his baptism, an experience in altered reality. The testing of Jesus, also called the temptation of Jesus, an experience in altered states of consciousness. Of course, walking on the sea stories, which we have been dealing with at some length in these presentations, another ASC experience. The transfiguration accounts of Jesus, another example of Jesus in altered reality. and of course, the resurrection appearances, also ASC experiences, that we will deal with soon. When Jesus comes walking on the Sea of Galilee toward his disciples, 1. They are frightened. 2. They do not recognize Jesus, thinking instead that they are seeing a ghost. 3. Jesus calms them, "Be not afraid." 4. Jesus identifies himself, "It is I." So far so good for this being an example of an ASC experience. The document we call Matthew illustrates what happens when a person breaks the trance. The Matthean Peter is not convinced that he is really seeing the Matthean Jesus and demands, "If it is you, bid me to come to you on the water." Jesus says, "Come," and Peter progresses toward Jesus. But then the wind, the personified wind, startled him. His fear returns, his skepticism returns, and he began to sink, as will happen if one steps out of alternate reality back into consensual reality, out of the trance into a waking state. The trance experience will not continue in the waking state, just as a dream interrupted does not ordinarily resume after the interruption, despite diligent attempts to fall back asleep again into the dream. True to the style of high-context literature, the Gospels we call Mark and John do not report the meaning of this ASC experience. They presume that their intended audience knows it. While in the document called Mark, the disciples are utterly astounded and still puzzling over the multiplied loaves of bread, in the fourth Gospel we call John, they are glad to take him into the boat. The Gospel called Matthew spells out the purpose, perhaps as the author we call Matthew sees it, understands it, interprets it. Jesus is the Son of God. This trance experience provides the disciples with yet another insight into the identity of Jesus, a new piece of information or further confirmation of an insight already known but gradually deepening. Anthropological psychologists who specialize in ASC experiences emphasize that the content of these experiences is vacuous, hence Peter's doubt. You'll recall that visions do not come with soundtracks. Your culturally informed brain provides the soundtrack, meaning it provides the interpretation of what you're experiencing. It is the culture of the recipient to the vision that provides the information necessary to interpret the experience. Since all things come from God, we can say this is inspired from God. The cultural baggage also. And this is where the cultural baggage, the cultural information from both the Old Testament and from the pre-gospel reports from polytheistic traditions is relevant. This is where the parallels with Moses' power over the sea is relevant, as is Poseidon's rule over the sea is relevant. Narrow concentration on literal correspondences to construct the literary form, though, misses the forest for the trees. Both sources, whether it's Old Testament reports, like of Moses controlling the waves, parting the sea, or the pre-gospel polytheistic reports of Poseidon control of the sea, indicate that the activity of walking on the sea or making a pathway in the sea demonstrates that such a person is superior to and in control of the personified sea, whether he is riding a chariot on the waves or literally walking on its surface. The First Testament is particularly helpful here because it echoes a motif that occurs frequently in the Gospels. From the very beginning of Genesis, the second verse, the God of Israel is over the waters. God's breath or spirit or powerful wind is over and in control of the waves of the abyss. In the New Testament, Jesus seems to be doing something that only the God of Israel can do. In this case, walking on the sea. Now, do we conclude from that means these stories are saying Jesus is God? Hold on. It would be premature to conclude that from these stories alone, the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and John are claiming divinity for Jesus. We have to remember that doctrine develops, and it takes a long time to unpack all of these things and arrive at our Niceno-Constantinopolitan profession of faith. Centuries. We should not proof text our doctrines from these stories. It would be premature to conclude that Jesus is God from these stories alone. That isn't what the original audiences, the intended audiences of Mark, Matthew, and John would take from them. Rather, the intended audiences would recognize that Jesus is an extraordinary human being, one with a seemingly distinctive relationship to God, the one who normally behaves this way over the waters. Somehow, Jesus is able to do what only God can do. He must be authorized by God to do this. In the Hebrew tradition, this cumulative evidence would continue to build Jesus' reputation as a holy man, a chazid or tzaddik, that is, an Israelite shamanic figure who has a special relationship to the God of Israel and can barter special benefits or favors with alternate reality for fellow humans. He can navigate the worlds. Some concordances list the appearance of the risen Jesus in Luke chapter 24, verse 37, as a parallel to the story of Jesus walking on the sea. Actually, the elements of fear, lack of recognition, allaying of fear, and communication of new information or assurance of a course of action to be taken, common to ASC experiences, are quite normal in the resurrection appearances found in the Gospels, which are also experiences of a person's alternate reality, namely Jesus' alternate reality. Recall that these accounts of Jesus walking on the sea are culturally patterned experience, not a literary invention or creation or device. It is inappropriate, therefore, to consider the ASC experience of Jesus walking on the sea as a retrojected resurrection experience. It has often been repeated that the historical critical method is dead. It's been dead for over 50 years. It simply has not delivered what it promised. And what did it promise? To give us a clearer, more realistic picture of the historical Jesus. Perhaps the real problem is that the historical critical method has been neither sufficiently historical nor sufficiently critical. Cultural insights about the pan-human experience of alternate states of consciousness would enhance both literary critical and historical critical studies. In this light, the historical Jesus stands out ever so clearly as a typical person of his first century Mediterranean culture.